We can have that conversation later.
We are live on Facebook.
Hey. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Razel Candid, and on behalf of the Jewish Public Library, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual literary salon featuring Goldie Morgentaler. Our talk tonight is sponsored by the Rosalind Goodman Cultural Institute. And Goldie will be discussing tonight Confessions of a Yiddish Writer, which is a collection of essays by her mother, the Canadian Yiddish novelist Chava Rosenfarb. The discussion will focus on how the book came to be. I will include a reading from one of the essays about Yiddish Montreal. At the end of Goldie's talk, I'll have the pleasure of asking her some questions, and we'll get to know a little bit more about Goldie. But as part of the formal introduction, Goldie is a native Montrealer. She is a professor of English at the University of Lethbridge, Alberta, where she teaches 19th century British and American literature, as well as modern Jewish literature. She is the translator from Yiddish to English of much of Chava Rosenfarb's works, including Rosenfarb's seminal Holocaust novel, The Tree of Life, a trilogy of life in the Lodz ghetto. Goldie's translations of Rosenfarb's book of short stories, Survivor, 7 short stories, won a Canadian Jewish Book Award in 2019, and the Modern Language Association Memorial Prize in Yiddish Studies. Goldie is also a very talented artist, and I had the pleasure of seeing some of her work when I visited her in New York many, many years ago. Confessions of a Yiddish Writer is published by the McGill Queen's University Press that is offering the book at a 20% discount to anyone who orders it from their website before June 30th. The code to order the book is MQCR. So I'll repeat that again. McGill Queen's University Press is offering the book at a 20% discount to anyone who orders it from their website before June 30th, and the code is MQCR. When Chava Rosenfarb arrived to Montreal in 1949, she was greeted by a delegation of Yiddish poets and writers who had come to welcome the new young star on the Yiddish literature horizon. Chava more than lived up to her early reputation. Today, we are just as excited to greet Goldie Morgentaler. And if not for the cursed pandemic, you would be joining me in shouting, hooray, hooray, Goldie is back in town. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I present to you Goldie Morgentaler.
Thank you, Razel, and thank you to the Jewish Public Library for inviting me to speak at the virtual literary salon. I have not lived in Montreal since 1997, but as Razel said, I was born and raised in the city. And the Jewish Public Library was an integral part of my upbringing, and it remains one of my fondest memories of Montreal. One of the places that makes me most nostalgic whenever I think of my past. Of course, my experience at the library was bound up with the fact that my mother, the Yiddish novelist Chava Rosenfarb, was frequently invited to be a speaker at library events. Because she was herself a Holocaust survivor, my mother often spoke at the yearly Holocaust commemorations and memorials that were held at the library. And because she was a Yiddish writer, she was also invited to give lectures on various literary topics. In fact, this book of essays, Confessions of a Yiddish Writer, which I'll be talking about today, is made up of some of the lectures that she delivered at the library. And if you'll forgive me another plug for the book, as Raizel said, it is available from the McGill Queen's University Press website at a 20% discount until June 30th, and the code is MQCR. As I said, my mother, Chava Rosenfarb, was a Yiddish language novelist, the author of an epic 3-volume novel called The Tree of Life, a trilogy of life in the Lodz Ghetto, as well as of other fictions, mostly based on her experiences during the Holocaust. She wrote numerous short stories, plays, and essays, and she published 4 collections of poetry during her lifetime, all in Yiddish. Some of this work, such as The Tree of Life and her short stories, have been translated into English. But when Chava died in 2011, she left a lot of her work untranslated, notably her novel Letters to Abrasha, and almost all of her numerous essays. Chava had written a great many essays in her career as a writer, some at the instigation of Avrum Sutzkever, the great Yiddish poet and editor of the prestigious Yiddish literary journal, Die Goldene Kite, who frequently asked her for material for his publication. To accommodate Sutzkever, Chava often turned her public lectures into essays. Of those many essays, there was one in particular that she herself had translated and that she was anxious to get into print. It was a memoir of Simcha Bunim Shayevich, the poet of the Lodz Ghetto, whom Chava always referred to as her mentor. She had first met Shayevich during the 4 long years that she had spent imprisoned in the ghetto, along with the rest of the Jewish population of Lodz. The Lodz Ghetto was liquidated in August 1944, when all those who remained alive were deported to Auschwitz. Shayevich was sent to the gas chamber not long after that at Kaufring concentration camp, a sub-camp of Dachau. I don't believe that Chava ever had a notion of publishing all her essays together in one book. At least she never said anything about this. That was my idea. But the essay about Shayevich was dear to her heart. So in the early 1990s, she translated it herself into English, asked me to edit it for her, and then nothing. She didn't know where to send it for publication. She sent queries to the English language journals and magazines at the time, especially the American Jewish journals like Commentary and Midstream. But she had no luck, probably because the essay was too long to fit into conventional magazine format, but more likely because its topic, a poet whom no one had heard of, by a writer whom no one had heard of, was too obscure. Chava Rosenfarb was not a known quantity in the English-speaking world of the 1990s. After Chava's death, I found the English translation of this essay about Shayevich among her papers. I had not read it since I had helped her to edit it in 1992. I was impressed, and I thought this really ought to be published. I knew that the essay had meant a great deal to her, and that Shayevich himself had meant a great deal to her. I remember the difficulties that Chava had had in publishing the English translation of the Shayevich essay, and I determined that I would try again. I showed the essay to the writer, David Bezmozgis, who had been my student at McGill University. He suggested that I submit it to the online journal Tablet magazine, and he made the shidduch with the editors of Tablet. They accepted it without hesitation, and it was very successfully received. So buoyed by this success, I sent them another work, the Bergen-Belsen Diary of 1945. Bergen-Belsen Diary recounts the days that Chava, her mother and sister, spent in the displaced persons camp at Bergen-Belsen right after their liberation. I had found a very poor translation of this diary among my mother's papers after her death. The translation was the work of a woman whose name I did not know, but who clearly knew Yiddish better than she knew English, because the English text seemed to be little more than a verbatim rendering of the Yiddish without regard for English grammar or syntax. But if I didn't know the translator, I did know the story behind that translation. The Bergen-Belsen Diary, originally called in Yiddish Fragmenten von a Togbuch, Fragments of a Diary, was appended to Chava's very first publication, the poetry collection Die Ballade von Nächtigen Wald, the Ballad of Yesterday's Forest. While it was based on the diary that Chava actually kept after her liberation from Bergen-Belsen, she had edited and changed it. One of the things that she had edited out before its Yiddish publication in 1948 in Montreal was her relationship with a British soldier named Douglas Jensen, who had been with the British Army that liberated the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. They had met at a Yiddish language concert held on the grounds of the Bergen-Belsen DP camp shortly after the liberation in 1945. Just before the start of that concert, Chava noticed a British soldier sitting in the row in front of her and guessed that he was not Jewish. Afraid that he would not understand what was being said, she offered her services as a translator. With that, they became friends. Indeed, they became friends for life. The relationship would very likely have blossomed into a romance had my mother not learned that her wartime boyfriend, Goldie Morgentaler, my father, had survived the war. Nevertheless, Chava and Douglas Jensen remained good friends until Chava's death in 2011, although they seldom saw each other since Douglas lived in England and Chava settled in Canada. Chava sent him everything she wrote in Yiddish and in English, including when it was published in 1948, Die Ballade von Nächtigen Wald, even though she knew that Douglas could not read the Yiddish. Nothing daunted, Douglas put an ad in the British press seeking a Yiddish to English translator for the Bergen-Belsen Diary, and he found one who sent him a handwritten copy of her translation. This was the translation I found. Douglas wrote to my mother to tell her that he had had her diary translated, but to her eager questions about what he thought of her work, he gave only diplomatic, non-committal answers. Now that I had the actual translation of the diary in front of me, I could see why. The English was not idiomatic, and some phrases were so convoluted that it was hard to understand what was being said. So I decided to translate the diary myself. It was this translation that Tablet magazine published on Holocaust Memorial Day 2014. Having now had some success with publishing 2 of my mother's nonfiction essays in English, I conceived of the idea of a collection of essays. That was the genesis of the current book. I took the title of the collection, Confessions of a Yiddish Writer, from Chava's signature public lecture, delivered whenever she was invited to speak anywhere in English. In fact, the Jewish Public Library has an audio copy of this lecture from when it was delivered in the library in 2004. This is the only one of the many lectures that Chava gave at the library that was delivered in English. All the rest were in Yiddish. The word confessions in the title suggests just how intertwined Chava's actual life was with her artistic one, an intertwining that she was perfectly aware of. As she explained in the second paragraph of this essay, writing is a form of confession in disguise. No matter what the subject, all literary roads lead back to the self. The essay speaks of Chava's childhood in Lodz, Poland, of the influence on her of the Bund, of the importance of Yiddish to her intellectual development, her experiences during the war in the Lodz ghetto and the camps. But mostly it describes the imaginative process by which she came to write her masterpiece, the 3-volume The Tree of Life. The essays collected in Confessions of a Yiddish Writer represent only a portion of the many essays and reviews that Chava contributed to a variety of Yiddish publications, not to mention the numerous lectures that she gave at the Jewish Public Library, as well as elsewhere. They also represent the first time that Chava's nonfiction work have been published as a group in English or in Yiddish. I had a simple principle for selection. Namely, I chose those essays that most appealed to me aesthetically, or that I'd had a hand in translating myself into English, either for public presentation or for publication. With the exception of the essay, A Yiddish Writer Reflects on Translation, which was written and delivered in English as a keynote address to a joint meeting of the Literary Translators Associations of Canada and the United States in 2005. All the essays were originally written in Yiddish. The essay on feminism in Yiddish literature, delivered at a conference of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, was written at a time when feminism was very much in the news, but had not yet been applied to Yiddish literature in any kind of systematic way. The conference at which Chava first read her essay was one of the first attempts to focus a critical lens on Yiddish and Hebrew literature from a feminist perspective. The reason that such a perspective had taken so long to take hold in the field of Yiddish studies is alluded to in the essay, namely that given the widespread anti-Semitism experienced by the Jews in Europe, Yiddish literary women felt uncomfortable making too much of their feminism when the greater danger of violence hovered over all Jews, and later when Yiddish literature itself faced oblivion. Chava was always very sympathetic to feminism as a movement. She was particularly aware of the kinds of problems women writers encountered. She herself reached out to her fellow female prose writer, Bluma Lempel, another contributor to the Goldene. Chava and Bluma were among the very small number of women writers whose works appeared in the Goldene. Chava sent Bluma Lempel a fan letter, and the two women became friends, mostly through correspondence, although they did meet once in Montreal and possibly in New York as well. Chava was also very close friends with Zhenya Larsen, the Lodz-born Swedish writer whose trilogy on the Holocaust became a bestseller in Sweden. She felt strongly that women writers needed to support each other. So it must have been very painful for Chava when the friendship with Bluma Lempel floundered, because Bluma mistook the first-person narrator of Chava's novella, Edja's Revenge, to be a stand-in for Chava herself. Edja's Revenge is the story of a capo, one of those Jews who saved their own lives, or tried to, by working for the Nazis. Bluma took the first-person narration literally and assumed that Chava was writing about herself, a strange confusion from the author of a story called Oedipus in Brooklyn, which is about a mother-son incest, and that even Sutzkever thought was too shocking to publish. Bluma eventually came to her senses and apologized for accusing Chava of having been a capo, but the damage was done and the friendship was over. Chava herself suffered from sexism, and some of the comments about her work that appeared in the Jewish press are instructive. For instance, when her play, The Bird of the Ghetto, was being prepared for performance by the Habima in Israel, the Canadian Jewish Chronicle wrote, and I quote, "The wife of a Montreal Jewish doctor and the mother of growing children, one of the highly regarded poets in Yiddish literature, has had her drama, The Bird of the Ghetto, accepted for presentation by Israel's National Theater, the Habima." That's the end of the quote. You will notice that the hierarchy of importance goes from her being the wife of a doctor, then a mother of growing children, and lastly, a highly regarded poet. And when Melech Ravitch tried to raise funds for the Yiddish publication of The Tree of Life, he wrote that the book was written with an, I quote, "with an iron-willed self-discipline and Homeric sweep that is amazing in a woman writer. The more so, since there's not a single trace of hysteria in the writing." Personally, I have never been able to shake the suspicion that Chava is not better known as a writer about the Holocaust because she was a woman, living and writing at a time when women's work in general was devalued. Some of the other literary essays included in this volume deal with the lives of Jewish writers, such as Stefan Zweig, Sholem Asch, Isaac Bashevis Singer, Paul Celan, as well as the Montreal Yiddish language poets Yud Siegel, Ruchel Korn, and Melech Ravitch. Another essay speculates on the reason for the rash of suicides among Jewish writers who had survived the Holocaust. Because of the range of topics on which she wrote, this present collection of essays is divided into 3 sections, of which the first is the most personal and autobiographical, consisting of several first-person essays about Chava's childhood and her experiences during the Holocaust. The second section, which is the largest, consists of literary essays and analyses, mostly of the work of Jewish writers. The final section consists of 2 travelogues. While the essays are on different topics and were written and published at different times, they do follow in rough chronological order the outlines of Chava's life, beginning with her childhood in Poland and her experiences during the Holocaust, then dealing with Jewish literary life in Montreal, finally ending with the account of 2 journeys, one to Australia and the other to Prague, that she made with her second life partner, Bona Wiener of Australia. The Australian essay in particular demonstrates a lighter side of Chava's personality, as she affectionately describes the foibles of Jewish life in Melbourne, Australia in the 1970s. A recurrent theme in several of these essays is the tenuous survival of Yiddish in the post-Holocaust world, and what it means to be a writer in a language with fewer and fewer readers. I am sure that I do not need to underline for you how painful and dispiriting the loss of a language can be, and especially for a writer who watches as her readership diminishes and the venues where she can publish vanish. In the essay that deals most directly with this topic, A Yiddish Writer Reflects on Translation, Chava describes Yiddish Montreal as she first knew it after her arrival in Canada, and gives a picture of its vibrancy. But she ends her essay on the Yiddish poets of Montreal, Yud Siegel, Melech Ravitch, and Rochel Korn, with the following commentary. Now the sky has darkened in the garden of Canadian Yiddish creativity, just as it has darkened everywhere else in the world. Yud Siegel once asked desolately, "Is it autumn in your garden, Yiddish? Are we with trembling hands reaping the last fruit from your branches? Perhaps there will come another summer, another miracle, and above our tired eyes, new fruit will appear." Despite this hopeful thought, I do not believe that Chava really entertained many illusions about the future of Yiddish. In her essay on translation, she says this: "Upon my arrival in Montreal in 1950, I found the bustling Yiddish social life. Without having to wait until I learned English properly, I could read the Yiddish newspaper, the Canada Odler, every day, and so keep up to date with world and Canadian news events. I counted more than 40 Yiddish writers living in Canada in the years just after my arrival, writers of international reputation and recognized all over the Yiddish-speaking world, as well as more marginal writers, so-called graphomanes. There was an active Yiddish Writers Union in Montreal, which I joined. There were public lectures on literary topics. I do not have time to enumerate the many Yiddish language journalists, historians, pedagogues, essayists who lived in Canada in the early 1950s. But by the 1980s, that time was gone. What does it mean to be a Yiddish writer in Canada today? Writing in Yiddish is not the same as writing in any other language. Most languages have a home and native land where potential readers speak the language of the writer. That is not true of Yiddish. For me, writing in Yiddish has meant writing in a language that my son cannot read. It has meant relying on translations with all their inevitable imperfections to be read at all. It has meant feeling like an anachronism and hoping that that feeling is mistaken. Yiddish is my own language, as near to me as the skin on my body. In my youth, when I read the works of the great European writers, they all spoke to me in Yiddish because I read them in Yiddish translation. Yiddish was my Esperanto, my key to understanding the lives of other peoples. It established the affinity between them and me, giving me an entree into the obscurest corners of the human soul. To me, Yiddish was never a parochial language. On the contrary, Yiddish literature was a splendid edifice with open doors and windows. When I started to write in Yiddish, I was hoping to emulate my foreign language idols, that is, European writers whom I worshipped and read in Yiddish. My burning ambition was to be deserving of their distinguished company. They were my literary role models, my guides, who taught me that the only way I could join them was not by emulating them, but by being true to myself in the fullest sense of the word and writing in the language that best expressed my authentic self, that is, in Yiddish. Now, my literary friends and fellow writers are all gone. Yiddish Montreal no longer exists. I am a writer and I cannot speak only to myself. But as I venture out into broader English language waters, I am overcome by trepidation. I wonder whether I, with my painful history and my East European Jewish sensibility, will be understood by an English language readership. Will Canadian readers accept my fiction's harrowing subject matter? Will the translation be good enough to convey my meaning? What affects me most is the constant sense of isolation that I feel as a Holocaust survivor, an isolation enhanced by my being a Yiddish writer. I feel myself to be an anachronism, wandering across a page of history where I do not really belong. If writing is a lonely profession, The Yiddish writer's loneliness has an added dimension. Her readership has perished. Her language has gone up with the smoke of the crematoria. She creates in a vacuum, almost without a readership, out of fidelity to a vanished language, as if to prove that Nazism did not succeed in extinguishing the language's last breath, that it is still alive. Creativity is a life-affirming activity. Lack of response to creativity and being condemned to write for the desk drawer is a stifling, destructive experience. Sandwiched between these two misfortunes struggles the spirit of the contemporary Yiddish writer. Nevertheless, I hold to my old romantic belief that writers of all times and places belong to a noble fellowship, that although they are the voices of their own cultures and languages, they transcend these boundaries. This belief helps me surmount my doubts as I reach out in my foreign language of English to the hearts and minds of the people among whom I live. I want to be accepted as an equal by my literary peers in this country, be recognized as a writer who is both Jewish and Canadian. I want to come in from the cold. I hope you will allow my mother, along with all the other Yiddish writers, to come in from the cold, to remain vibrant and alive by reading their works, even if it means reading them in translation, and to get a sense from the essays in this collection of what it means to have been a Yiddish writer. Thank you.
Thank you, Goldie. That talk is so moving because and that's one of my first questions to you is, you work so closely with your mother in translating her work while she was alive. How did it feel to be translating her work now that she's gone?
Well, in some ways, I like doing it because it makes me feel that she's still alive. I mean, I read her words, right, on the page, and I have the sense that she's still with me, because what she wrote was to a large extent who she was. And so in that sense, I enjoy doing it. I feel like I'm communing with her. But when it comes to the nitty gritty of translation, such as things like that I don't understand, or Polish words that sometimes occur, I feel the loss because I have no one to ask. Or rather, that's not entirely true. I came across a Polish expression in the novel I'm translating now, and I asked the Polish friend what it meant, and it turned out to be, so I got an answer, but it was, it would have been better and easier if I'd had her to ask. The other thing is that sometimes when you translate, you can't translate verbatim. And so I make changes in the text, and I would have liked to have her approval. And obviously that can't happen. So it's a mixed kind of feeling.
Hey, and when you were working with her, did she give you freedom as a translator? How was it then?
No. Well, I mean, we discussed things. We had terrible fights. We fought over translation a lot, especially if I wanted to change something and she didn't want it changed, or she wanted to use a Yiddish word in the English text that I thought should be translated. We had a lot of disagreements, but I think in the end, it came out all right. And I guess I miss those arguments. I mean, we really had terrible fights, but she checked everything. Her English was excellent. So she checked everything I did. And of course it didn't go unless she approved. I didn't, it couldn't go ahead. So in that sense, she didn't give me very much freedom. But in the back and forth between us, in the disagreements, we usually came to an understanding. I would say, you can't say that, it's not English. And she would say, but I want to say that. And what a terrible language English is. It's not no sentiment in this language whatsoever. And then and it would go on like that. But we met in the middle usually.
Yeah, I remember attending a lecture that she gave in English, and I'll never forget the first line that she opened her lecture with. It really impressed me. It says, "I mine the depths of my soul," and the image immediately struck me because there are very few native English speakers who had the kind of command of imagery, the way Chava expressed herself. It was really quite an amazing experience to just listen to her speak in English. No, and go on.
No, I was just going to say she would have been very happy to hear that because she always felt very insecure about her English.
She had nothing to worry about. She stood up there with the best of them. And you talked about how she was a feminist and how she experienced, sexism, and hearing the comment from Melech Ravitch that, the fact that he's surprised that she could write without hysteria, was Chava's experience as a female writer, was it, to your knowledge, was it very different from other English women or from other women writers of her generation?
You mean her experience as a writer in Yiddish?
Yeah, or no, even as an English writer, of the women of her generation, or what, was it very different?
I think she had no luck. And she, like, the Tree of Life was translated and went from publisher to publisher, and didn't find a publisher until it was passed around. I don't know. So the question is, was it because she was a woman that people were not interested? And as I said with the essay about Shayevich, she couldn't get anyone to be interested. So was it because nobody'd heard of her and all her writing was in Yiddish? And so that's one possibility to explain that. Or was it because she was a woman? I have, it's hard to know what it was, or maybe just both things together. But I do remember her sending things out. One of the essays in this book of essays, Shloimele, I told her to send it out to a journal that I don't think exists anymore in Canada called Saturday Night. Mm-hmm. And she sent a query letter, which is what you're supposed to do. And she immediately got back a rejection. Like he wasn't even interested in reading it, even though she had explained what the story was about. So, it's hard to know why you get rejection. Was it because the editor didn't recognize her name, or was it because it's another woman writer, and you just sort of, well, what does she have to contribute? Like, so it's hard for me to know. I suspect that the combination of the fact that she was a woman writer and that she wrote mostly in Yiddish, so she didn't have a name in English, contributed to the fact that she didn't get a lot of her stuff published in English during her lifetime.
You commented that the article about Shayevich was so long, and I remember often hearing your mother talk at lectures, and her lectures certainly, as a rule, exceeded the standard 1 hour. because I think she had so much to say.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
you sort of got the feeling that she was just pouring, everything came pouring out of her as she was speaking, and as if she could never finish.
Yes. I think also she came from a tradition where you were supposed to speak for about 2 hours. I mean, in this book of essays, the one about Australia, she talks about how the proper lecture is supposed to be 2 hours long. And if a speaker didn't speak for 2 hours, the audience got very upset. So I think she's coming out of a different tradition, like the European tradition of the speaker who speaks at length.
But she always had so much to say, and you felt she was frustrated that she could never sort of give you more because she had so much to say.
That's an interesting thought. Yeah, I think there's a lot to that.
And were you yourself ever inspired to write other than academically?
Yes, I think like all people, I think all young people want to write at some point. So yes, I had ambitions to write. You mean write like fiction and things like that? Yeah, I did, but I think you need a certain kind of imagination and a certain kind of stick-to-itness that I'm not sure that I had. I did write. I wrote stories, and I got a few published, but not many. And I'd never had enough Sitzfleisch to sit down and actually try to write. I have a first draft of a novel, but I've never taken it much beyond that. So I had the ambition, but I never got around to doing anything with it.
Right. And when you spoke to your mom, what language did you communicate in?
Usually in later years, English, but very often Yiddish. So actually my mother lived with us in the last years of her life with my husband and me. And my husband never spoke Yiddish, and he picked up quite a bit. She taught him. So, but it was a mix of both of them. If I wanted to say something more intimate to her, I spoke in Yiddish, and she to me. But I mean, her English, we switched back and forth, so like without thinking about it. So it's hard for me to say offhand, but both, I would say.
Because she mentions in that essay that she writes in a language that her son doesn't read. So, and yet you yourself are so deeply involved, not only with your mother's writing, but with Jewish literature and so on. So why the difference?
Well, she actually, I think, tells a story in one of the essays. I think it's in the essay on translation of what happened with my brother. Like I grew up, Yiddish was the language of my home, right? So it's really my first language. I learned English at school, and my brother is younger than I am. So one day we were at the beach, I think in Cape Cod, and my brother was about 3 years old, and a little boy approached us and started to play with my brother, a little boy of about the same age. And my brother was happily chattering away to him in Yiddish. And the little boy started moving closer and closer to him because obviously didn't understand a word. And he finally turned to my father and said, "Doesn't he speak language?" And my father decided, okay, that's it. No more Yiddish. We are all from now on going to speak English at home, because the children have to know how to get along in the wider world. So my brother, who had gone to Jewish People's School for his first grade, was taken out of it and put into a private school where there was no Yiddish instruction whatsoever. It wasn't a Jewish school. And so while I stayed at the Volksschule, and then later on, I studied, I went back to Yiddish literature. I studied at the university. So my brother really grew up without the language. And certainly it's not his fault, but his father just sort of took him out in this kind of anxiety. I guess it's typical of immigrants, anxiety that his son would not be able to function in an English speaking world if he didn't learn English properly. So that's why my brother does not really speak Yiddish. And it's a shame. It is a shame.
And does he read your mom in translation?
Yes, I think so.
So have you ever talked, have you ever had a conversation with your brother about your mom as a writer, or in any way shared that with each other?
I can't think of us doing it. I mean, it was such a given in our household that I don't remember that we ever specifically talked about it. I know he certainly has all her books, and I'm pretty sure he's read them. But talk about her. I think he was very proud of her as a writer, as am I. I think she's a wonderful writer. But he had to wait until he could read her in English to really, I think, appreciate that.
And did you ever see your mom as just your mother and not as a writer?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, as far as I was concerned, she was my mother. She was not a writer until I was maybe in my 30s. I mean, I really resented her writing. I thought she should pay more attention to me. And but she was a very good mother, but she was also, she could get very distracted, and she didn't like to be interrupted when she was working. And she was writing all the time, like, every now and then I would say something and she'd jump up and run to her workroom and write it down because I'd said something that she wanted to put in her book. So, and I think real writers, I think they write all the time too in their heads, and they're always on the lookout for, pearls. But as far as I was concerned, until I was an adult, she was primarily my mother. I was pleased that she was recognized in Yiddish circles as a writer, but I hadn't read her. And my relationship with her was really mother and daughter until we started translating together, and then it changed.
Mm-hmm. And do you miss being in Montreal, Goldie?
Do I miss being in Montreal? Yes and no. I miss the atmosphere of Montreal. I miss hearing French. That was the biggest shock when I moved out to Alberta. I was so used to hearing French in the background, restaurants everywhere, and you don't hear that here. And I miss just the mountain, and in many ways Montreal is a beautiful city. But what I don't miss, and what I really did not regret leaving, was the constant tension over language, and it irritated me no end. And now with this bill that discriminates against Muslim women for wearing hijab, I just find that is so outrageous that I think to myself, well, I'm not that sorry that I don't live there anymore. So I mean, it's really mixed feelings. So on the one hand, I am nostalgic, miss my friends who are still there, and I miss the importance of Yiddish in Montreal. I'm living now in a city, Lethbridge, where there are almost no Jews. Like, I think my husband and I are maybe 1/3 of the Jewish population of Lethbridge. So I miss that. But there are things about Montreal that I definitely don't miss.
Okay, and what is waiting for us of Chava's papers? What have you found? What are you working on?
I'm working on Letters to Russia. I've been working on it for several years now and translating it. it's a big book. It's one volume. Unusually for my mother, it's one volume. But it's taking me a long time, mostly because I get interrupted by other things. But I'm hoping that this summer, since it's in forced lockdown, right? We're not going anywhere. I'll finally be able to finish it. I've published bits and pieces of it. There was a section got published in Tablet a year or two ago, but the novel as a whole has not been published. And so that's my next project. And also was working on a volume of her letters to her best friend, whom I mentioned, Jenja Larsson, the Swedish writer who was from Lodz and who made who really had a bestseller with her books about the Lodz ghetto, which are very similar to my mother's, really
Mhm.
amazing. So this was my mother's best friend, and they kept up a correspondence really since the end of the war until they were both old. So I'm hoping to get that published as well, because I think it's an interesting idea of what it was like for survivors after the war. How did they adjust to their new countries, like my mother to Canada and Jenja to Sweden. So that's what I'm working on.
Did your mother like being a Canadian?
She hated the winters. She absolutely hated the winters, and she ran away. And when she took up with Bono, they spent the winters here, they spent in Australia. But other than that, I think she was, yeah, I mean, she actually has an essay about the wonders of Canada and how good it felt not to be discriminated against, not to feel that you were a second-class citizen. So in that sense, yes, she liked Canada very much. The climate, not so much.
Understood why. Well, Goldie, I just want to thank you for a really wonderful talk, and for allowing us to get more insight into this incredible writer and woman who is Chava Rosenfarb, and for being so personal and forthcoming in your answers, and really looking forward to more work that you will produce, and will, because Chava was such an amazing person, and the more you read her, the greater the appetite to know more, the greater the eagerness. So thank you so much for your talk, and wish you lots of good health to continue in your wonderful labor of love. And just to remind everyone that the book, Confessions of a Yiddish Writer, is available through the McGill Queen's Press at a 20% discount before June the 30th. You can get it on their website, and the code is MQCR. And for our library devotees, on Friday, June the 19th, at 1 o'clock, our virtual book club is going to be discussing The Giver of Stars by Jojo Moyes, and the discussion will be led by our own Karen Biskin. So thank you, Goldie Morgentaler, for a wonderful evening, and thank you everyone for joining us. And stay well, stay healthy. Don't forget to wear a mask when you're in public and to wash your hands. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for everything.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.